Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of 219 GreenConnect, where we explore topics about green living and the environment in Northwest Indiana. For past show archives, news, and upcoming events, you can check out our website at 219greenconnect.com or join us on Facebook or Twitter. Our ID on both Facebook and Twitter is 219 GreenConnect. You can also subscribe to this podcast via iTunes. I'm your host, Kathy Sipple, and with me today I have artist-activist Thomas Frank, and he has been working with the Dunelands Environmental Justice Alliance on a recent initiative called Calumet Lives Matter. We've been seeing in the news quite a bit lately about some really disturbing things going on in East Chicago, and I reached out to Thomas to help fill me in and hopefully fill in listeners too about what is going on and what's needed, what can we do to help. So quite frankly, Thomas Frank, sorry, I didn't mean to make that pun, but I did it. Let me go ahead and just turn it over to you. So thanks again for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me. This is really nice to be able to talk about the situation in Calumet, the neighborhood of Calumet in East Chicago. Do you want me to do an overview real quick?
Yeah, I mean, from what I gather, just trying to read some things online, it seems like there's been what many would call an epic fail with people that were supposed to have their eye on the ball with a super fun cleanup site, and it's resulted in lead and arsenic. That's like kind of
right.
what I know, but yeah.
Right.
So what happened to lead us up to this? Yeah, just whatever you feel is appropriate.
Great.
I'm going to trust your judgment on it. You go for it.
Great. Well, let me give you a quick overview. So this is occurring in what we call the Calumet Industrial Corridor on the southern shores of Lake Michigan. We share that corridor with the southeast side of Chicago and extends all pretty much over to Chesterton and Michigan City, of course. And so we faced in these last 40 years a massive disinvestment of a lot of industries here. And we've had some struggling situations with steel and steel-related jobs. And we've seen, just in East Chicago alone, we've seen nearly 70,000 jobs lost in steel and steel-related industries here in East Chicago, and this is called Steel Town. Nonetheless, what we have here is trying to address some of the legacy problems of the last 100 years of industrialization. The Calumet neighborhood was bordered and also built on top of lead refineries. There were 5 within the area, one to the south, which is what the Superfund site has been named after. That's USS Lead. And there were 3 that occupied one of the neighborhoods, and that was called West Calumet, which in 1972 was they built a housing project on it. And that was Anaconda, which later became Eagle Pitcher. And then to the north, there was another lead refinery called U.S. Reduction. But nonetheless, today what we're facing is what's brought us to this moment now is that the mayor of East Chicago, in hearing the numbers in terms of lead contamination and arsenic contamination in the neighborhood of West Calumet, being as high as 91,000 parts per million of lead contamination, decided that he probably ought to trigger a forced evacuation of those residents. And it being a public housing project was probably a very smart thing to do. 91,000 parts per million is literally about 217 to 220 times above the allowable limit. It's severely contaminated, probably the worst in the country. And that's what we're facing, and that's what's really triggered this massive actuation.
Yeah, so my heart just really goes out to these people that, not only have nowhere to live, they find out that for years and years and years, some of them decades it seems, have been letting their kids outside playing in this contaminated soil, which is really what we try to, encourage kids to do, get outside, play in the dirt, enjoy nature. And so I guess my concern in this area is multi-pronged. It's just, number one, where are all these people going? What do they need? Is there an effort to, help out? How can people who are hearing about this plug in to kind of give them some relief? And then, number two, what's going to happen as far as the, health issues that have now come to light for not just kids, but I know kids are impacted more severely in most cases in terms of lead and other toxic substances, just because they're young and their immune systems are still developing. And then also, what's the plan for actually taking care of getting this cleaned up? And I'm not sure if you're going to have all of answers for each of these things as well, but just want to give you an opportunity to share with me and with listeners whatever you do know on all of those points.
Right. So what we've done is we formed a group called Calumet Lives Matter to try to help and address some of these issues. One of the things that happened, because we've allowed capital to escape and their escape responsibility, as these industries moved overseas, they just left their contaminants in the ground. People kind of laugh and chuckle about how Northwest Indiana is just a toxic dump and stuff, but what really has occurred is it has been allowed. It's an allowable program. It's a permitted program allowing industries to leave their contaminants here and walk away from it in terms of liability. What's happening right now is the cascading effects. Issues of housing that was built on a known lead refinery, issues of health of 40 years of populations, maybe 10,000 or tens of thousands of people that live there, and trying to make those people whole. So right now, the East Chicago Housing Authority is in the process of relocating people. It hasn't been, unfortunately, a smooth process. It's meant that we have had to step in with some attorneys to demand the rights of the residents, that the East Chicago Housing provide options for them, and that there are safe options, and that they provide for moving expenses, and that they provide for deposits as well. One of the hard things is that the Chicago Housing Authority has required them to continue paying their rent, even though they'll be moved out, and so that residents don't have monies for putting down deposits elsewhere. So we're trying to provide for the residents in this transition, and also we're also trying to provide for the health of them going forward. We're seeking testing. One of the things that's happened in the last couple of weeks is that the testing location and authorities that were doing the testings have shifted and changed to 5 different places, and it's really confused the residents. We're also asking for comprehensive testing, not just a prick, but drawing some blood. But and then moving into a treatment program. We're also looking, even though a child or a young adult may today not test high, it doesn't mean they didn't test high previously. So we're also asking for them to be assessed in terms of their development level and stuff like that. So in case, let's say, a 5-year-old who is very vulnerable to lead doesn't test high today, but maybe when they're when they're super vulnerable, had tested very high, and so today they won't be registered as somebody that's high in a dangerous situation, but we'll be carrying forward a lot of learning issues. So if we get them assessed going forward, they'll be able to draw on some resources, and then we're also asking for, like they did in Flint, expanded health care to be able to help them in the future going forward. So those are some of the initiatives that are happening today.
Well, thank you for sharing that with me. Is there a website where people listening can plug in and learn more about whatever might be the most up-to-date or current information on this?
Right. So right now we have Calumet Lives Matter on Facebook, and that's what we're utilizing more than anything else. There are multiple groups that have formed. There's another group that calls Environmental Justice Northwest Indiana, which is forming a nonprofit in this area. And there are other groups that have been helping as well. We have the Nurses United that have been helping. We have Black Lives Matter Gary, which has been helpful as well, and many other groups that have been kind of coming in and helping us canvass and do surveys and reach out to the community.
Okay, and I know you've been using a hashtag pretty successfully, Calumet Lives Matter, so probably people could plug that into their Facebook search and maybe find various threads from different groups, I would imagine.
Right,
that
right.
hashtag, would that be a recommended strategy?
Definitely.
Okay, good. And obviously, people first. That's the thing that really makes your heart go pitter patter. The land, is important as well, but want to make sure that those people and their health are taken care of. And then, then my attention turns to the land. We would hate to just have it evacuated and it just sits there, still contaminated. Nothing's happening toward remediation. Do you know if there are any plans for that yet, or is it just too soon?
No, this is what's been a part of the controversy, is that this has been known to be a contaminated site for nearly 44 years since they built the housing project, but also throughout the Calumet neighborhood. There are 3 zones, 3 areas. There's West Calumet, there's the Old Calumet, and there's what's called Hunky Town, which is the most probably middle-class neighborhood. And so they've known for quite a while that lead levels, they've been testing since 1985 in different areas. I think in 1990, there were concerns great enough to lead test all the young children under 6, and found that 40% of them tested high, above 10 milligrams per deciliter back then. Unfortunately, things had not picked up. Nothing had triggered actions previously. It's been a long, hard process to get to this point where we're actually getting some action. So what really has triggered this in the long term was that in 2009, the U.S. EPA finally declared this a Superfund, or put it on the national priority list. It had been a candidate since the early 1990s when they built what's called a canoe over one of the sites, the U.S. lead site. They built what's called a confined disposal facility. They put 40 feet of clay on a 21-acre site and put a liner around it because they knew that site of a lead refinery was very dangerous. But also at that time, they should have been thinking, looking forward and saying, at least, at what was going on in West Calumet, where they built a housing project on top of a lead refinery. And so that has triggered
very likely
kind of
suffer the same issues, right?
Yeah. And so over the years, they've kind of nibbled at trying, and what I would say, it's been a very professional process of not finding what you don't want to find, but nibbling at it a little bit because of certain concerns, like in 1990 when they tested the kids with lead, but didn't do anything about it, didn't trigger an action. But finally in 2009, it was placed on the national priority list. But unfortunately, most of that time has been devoted to finding and securing responsible parties, and also maybe doing a remediation plan, designing a remediation plan. But what they didn't do in the last 7 years is they didn't prioritize the population, the people that live there. And that's been the most unfortunate thing, is even up until a week after the mayor had declared that they wanted to demolish the site, they were still taking in residents. And even today, they are still taking in, the redevelopment authority is still taking in residents in the other zones of the Superfund site. So these are the kind of mixed messaging that we find, and they're placing more people in harm's way before they address the issue. So it's an era of lots of, what I would say is there are 2 major trends. You can look at the data, and you can see that it was revealing where the hot spots were and where you can go to. The reason why we didn't go to those is really something that has to be questioned. Clearly, we're not data-driven in this process. I think it's a lot to do with racism, a lot to do with limiting the liabilities of those who are in power. And I think that's what we've seen in the last 40 years in Northwest Indiana. And I think the other trend that represents that is regulatory capture. I think these industries run most of these regulatory agencies, determine much of their methodology. They hold most of the professional expertise on these issues. They have most of the attorneys. It's a very asymmetrical battle for health for low-income communities of color. And I think that's what we see here, two examples of.
Well, it's overwhelming to hear so many things all at once. It's just kind of hard to know how to, dig into the middle of it and untie this knot. But, I don't want everybody to just, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's something that we've been very much aware of. These are very toxic secrets that are very open in Northwest Indiana. Since the 80s and 90s, since we had the Calumet Task Force and various other organizations, they had pointed out a lot of these hot spots. We just have not addressed them, or we've allowed industry to continue to address them and paper over the problem. We expanded an airport. Airports are notoriously damaging to communities of color, low-income communities of color, placing a lot of the burden on them. And that's what we did here to drive economic development. And in so doing, we broke open a couple of pipelines that have been allowed to spill and are continuing to spill 3 or 4 or 5 years later. We have this is what I call business as usual in Northwest Indiana. This is normal practice. And it demonstrates some of the worst in this country.
Well, and you and I have spoken before. I think you've been a guest on the show before, if I'm not mistaken, or at least I know we've talked about your art in the past. Maybe it could have been through somebody else, but you were definitely in the conversation. And I kind of want to go back to just your title, the way that you refer to yourself as an artist activist, because you're obviously passionate. You obviously want to do something yourself. And I'm just curious, how do you use your role as artist to creatively approach something, that feels so big of an issue?
Right.
And I'm just, not trying to put it all on you, but I just want to try to activate within listeners kind of like, hey, what special gift do I have, or what ideas do I have to kind of move forward on some kind of partial solution or something that we can do while we wait for the powers that be to kind of get their collective acts together?
Well, the reason I identify myself as an artist activist is from early on, I trained and received lots of success in the arts. Went to graduate school on scholarship and stuff in the arts and fine arts and painting. But I also studied languages, philosophy, and urban planning, and that's really what brought me to Northwest Indiana and dealing with this. Is I was in the process of a master's degree in urban planning when I was tapped to be the director of the Inner Harbor Shipping Canal, which at the time was considered the most polluted body of water in America, and which incidentally goes right next to this neighborhood. And that's what taught me a lot of the issues about the environment. In that I was in the process of chairing a committee to do a comprehensive plan for East Chicago. And in so doing, you kept hitting the environmental issues, the impediments. And there was always a corporate interest or industrial interest that was trying to limit their liabilities on that land. And while I was looking to bring it into higher and better uses for the community, there were other interests that were really scared by what those interests might be, because that meant they were carrying they would have to pay. And they were doing everything they can to limit that. Part of the way of limiting it is running out the time clock of 30 years. If they can hold off action for 30 years, they can walk away. And so I ended up hurting. I wouldn't say hurting. I ended up not benefiting the community and not as much as I could in that professional capacity. And I also saw the whole region was aiming in a direction that was not benefiting the community. We weren't community focused. in any of our development. We're industrially focused. We have an industrial economy. And with BP coming here, we doubled down on the industrial economy of the 20th century instead of moving forward. But what I ended up finding myself doing is identifying more in the arts again, just to maintain my balance and to operate in a way that talks to the narrative of our region. I saw our political economy, our attorneys, our public officials failing us miserably with one decision after another, especially our regional leadership. And it really wasn't something I saw as a viable future forward for the region. So I ended up organizing with activists and artists, and then organizing more broadly within the Great Lakes region, and identifying with environmental justice, or another way of referring to it, environmental racism, and also climate justice movements, and organizing with those and trying to marry those two movements. And I think we see an example of that with Marktown. I mean, this is West Calumet didn't just happen in a vacuum. It's not just one accident. This is actually the third neighborhood in 2 decades in East Chicago that's been cannibalized by industry. First, it was the Brickyard in the mid-1990s. 2 years ago, it's Marktown, which is the National Historic District, because BP moved directly across the street from it. And now it's West Calumet. Now, this is also not the last neighborhood that's going to be cannibalized. We know that there are a great number of neighborhoods in very dangerous situations with industry adjacent to them or having been there previously. And I really have found it I've been more effective in operating in the artist activist space than in the public space. The public space is a dangerous space for people that are looking to help the community.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you said, that you, in your role, you even found, with the best of intentions, you felt like you were tied a little bit. So I get it, and I just really, appreciate you bringing this message today, and even the frustration part, because it's honest, and, I think you can probably empathize to some extent, the people on both sides, because you've kind of been there. So, I love that you're using your art to kind of educate and change things, and I'd just like to throw out a few other ideas that I'm aware of that might somehow play a part in this, and that might give you a little time to think of additional comments you'd like to say to wrap up to. But I will actually be interviewing another guest here soon on the podcast that I think might be talking about something that could fit into this fairly well. Her name is Linda Rosenthal, and she is a facilitator for the Pachamama Alliance. She's going to be hosting a symposium called Awakening the Dreamer in Hammond on September the 25th. I don't know that I've got exact times for that yet. I think it's going to be like 12:30 to 5, I want to say, and that will be held at Unity in Hammond. So it's a Unity Church, Unity Spiritual Center in Hammond. And if you don't know about the Pachamama Alliance, basically it's a nonprofit organization that's basically trying to urge people all over the world, but especially in the U.S., where we, do have quite a bit of industry, to look at the earth as a whole and the whole human family to kind of create a new future together. So I just actually completed another online program that they do called the Game Changer Intensive. It's a 7-week program where you meet with people all over the world. We had people from Australia, and it was really kind of an interesting group, and we all just focused on what part can we play. So if you're hearing this, and whether you want to plug into this particular issue, which I suspect is going to take a lot of hands and hearts and wallets to help, from a grassroots perspective as well as from the powers that be, that might be a good framework for you to just kind of get in and talk to, some like-minded others as an additional resource that you can get through the organization Thomas has already named. Maybe coming about it just from a slightly, different angle as well. So I believe that's completely free to attend, and I'm going to be there. I think it's going to be a really good program. Just another couple of things that I'm thinking of. I have no idea if this is way, way out there, but I had really wanted to go into Chicago last week to hear an author that I'm interested in, Peter McCoy. He wrote a book called Radical Mycology, and I know part of what he was talking about was using mushrooms or, mycorrhizal fungi, whatever you say, to kind of draw out heavy metals from the soil, including lead, and arsenic. So I know that would be, possibly a little crazy, but I follow a lot of crazy threads. So I just want to throw it out there in hopes that maybe somebody smarter than me can put it together. Or maybe I could even get Peter McCoy on this, podcast, which would be pretty cool. But, how do we go to the root of it? That's one thing I really valued about going through the Pachamama Alliance's online program with the Game Changer Intensive, is they said, if you're going to go after solutions, make sure you're going after the root of the problem versus just a symptom, because, that can get frustrating. So if you really want to change the game, go to the source. And I don't doubt that you're doing that, Thomas, because I think you go in pretty deep and really educate yourself. So I really appreciate that about you. And then just one last possible resource I'd like to throw out there is, I launched a community-wide time bank, or I should say region-wide time bank. It's called CoThrive Timebank. And it acknowledges that, yes, we have this economy that's mostly, run by industry and big business, but we, the people, can have our own economy that's not really based on money. It's based on time and performing services for one another. And, I'm thinking these people have just been evacuated. They're not going to be great candidates probably. They're in a transition mode. They just need help. But what I found is we've attracted a lot of people to the time bank that may not really need any help and are willing to kind of put their hours forth toward a big project. So I'm just going to kind of put that out there as an intention that I'd love to attract people, willing to kind of gather around helping, whatever that's going to look like in the future. But we'd certainly be happy to look at that in the coming weeks and months. So anyway, that's right. What I've got. If people want more about CoThrive, they can go to cothrive.org/timebank. And if you want more about, I don't know if we've got it out on a website yet for that Awakening the Dreamer Symposium, but you can probably go to pachamama.org. That's PACHAMAMA.org, and I bet that they're going to have it listed on their calendar. So anyway, we've just got a few minutes left. Is there anything that you would like to say in conclusion, Thomas?
Well, I would agree with you. I think for everybody to start from where they are and see how they can get involved from their own perspective, their own way of understanding, their own set of skills, and then build out connections. Get involved, build out connections. One of the things about Northwest Indiana is we have a rich history. Renee Hatcher has been really good about bringing out a long history of what we call a solidarity economy, starting way back in the 30s when African Americans in the region had to build out their own resources and their own kind of local economy. And we can see opportunities there, and also building out forward to a green industrial economy. We're a working class community. There's no reason why we have to be accepting industries here that externalize their costs into the air, water, and land, poisons, toxins, that, communities of color receive 7 times more toxins in their air, breathe 7 times more toxins in there than white communities. And we shouldn't have to accept that. We should be able to say zero emissions. And every time we say zero emissions, that means more jobs for pollution controls. So there isn't a battle between the union and the worker and the environmentalist. So I think starting where you can, I think we can make connections and building out those connections, building out solidarity movements between us with Black Lives Matter, with nurses unions, with the teachers. There's a lot of ways in which we can move forward.
Well said. And I have a feeling that this is going to be an issue that we're going to be talking about or wanted to talk about for a while. So I'd love just to invite you in advance to come back when we know a bit more and when we've got, the next chapter of how this all unfolds. So I really appreciate you being with me here today, and we are out of time for this episode. But thank you once again for joining me. I'm Kathy Sipple, your host, and this has been another episode of 219 GreenConnect.
And thank you.
Thank you.